My family kicked me out in the rain because I had no job. 5 years later they came back saying you're alone, this house is ours now. I made one call. I opened my front door one afternoon to find my family standing there with suitcases, ready to move in. They smiled, like nothing was wrong, but the words my mother spoke next hit me like a physical blow, demanding my house as if it were theirs for the taking. It had been 5 long years since they threw me out into a thunderstorm, jobless and broken. 5 years where I clawed my way back from nothing, learning the hard way that blood doesn't always mean family. My name is Caleb. And this story starts in my childhood bedroom, staring at a laptop screen, my severance email open, as I listen to my mom, Eleanor, already complaining about me downstairs to my brother, Logan. The tech company I worked for had just gone through massive layoffs, and I was one of the casualties. So, here I was, back home temporarily while I figured things out. I was 29, single, no kids, no wife. According to them, I was a complete failure. Eleanor never understood why I chose software development instead of joining the family construction business with Logan. And my sister, Chloe, always made sure to remind me at every holiday dinner that her husband, Michael, had a real career with benefits and a pension. I'd been at my parents' place for about 3 weeks when things started getting really tense. The last 3 days before that rainy night were brutal. Eleanor stopped talking to me at breakfast, she'd just put down coffee and walk out. Logan started locking his home office door whenever I walked past, like I was planning to steal something. Chloe had been coming over almost every day, which was weird, because normally she only showed up for holidays. I'd hear the 3 of them talking in low voices on the back patio when they thought I was asleep. I tried to ignore it all, focusing on job applications, sending out resumes, and networking with old colleagues. But every time I came downstairs, I could feel their eyes on me, judging every single move. Then came that Tuesday night. The rain had just started when Logan walked into my room without knocking, around 8:30. "Mom wants to talk to you," he said. I could tell by his tone this wasn't going to be pleasant. I followed him downstairs and found Eleanor and Chloe waiting in the kitchen. They both had these expressions, like they'd been planning this moment for weeks. Eleanor didn't even let me sit down before she started in on me about wasting my life, how I should have listened to her years ago, how I was almost 30 and had nothing to show for it. Chloe chimed in with her usual comparisons to Michael, who apparently just got another promotion. And Logan stood in the doorway, nodding along like backup. "You need to get your life together, Caleb," Eleanor said, and her voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "We can't keep supporting you while you figure things out." I tried to explain that I had savings, that I was already getting responses from recruiters, that I just needed a few more weeks, but she wasn't listening. Logan stepped forward and told me I was setting a bad example for his kids. Chloe added that it was embarrassing when her friends asked about me. The rain was getting heavier outside. And then Eleanor said the words I'll never forget, "I think it's time you leave." When I asked where I was supposed to go at 9 o'clock at night in a thunderstorm, she just shrugged. Logan actually went upstairs and started throwing my clothes into my old camping backpack. Chloe stood there watching, like this was entertainment. I grabbed my laptop, my phone charger, and the backpack Logan practically threw at me. I stood in the doorway looking at these 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Eleanor wouldn't even make eye contact. Logan was already walking away, and Chloe was texting on her phone, probably telling Michael about the drama. The rain was coming down so hard, I could barely see my car in the driveway. I didn't even have a jacket because everything happened so fast. I sat in my car for probably 10 minutes, just trying to process what had happened, watching the rain blur my windshield. I felt completely alone. My phone had maybe 30% battery. I had about $200 in my checking account until my severance payment cleared. And I had nowhere to go except maybe a cheap motel on the highway. Then I remembered Ethan, my old college roommate, who I hadn't talked to in probably 6 months because I'd been so focused on work. Ethan and I had stayed loosely in touch after graduation, and I knew he was living about 40 minutes away, working as an attorney. I felt weird about calling him out of the blue to ask for help, but I sat there in that driveway for another 5 minutes watching the lights in my parents' house, hoping maybe Eleanor would come out and say she didn't mean it. But nobody came. The rain wasn't letting up, and I was already soaked from the 30 seconds it took to get from the front door to my car. So, I finally pulled out my phone and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. And when I explained what happened, he didn't ask questions or make me feel bad. He just gave me his address and told me to drive carefully. I took one last look at that house where I grew up, where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I used to help my dad with yard work on Saturdays before he passed away. And I realized that the people inside weren't the family I thought I knew. 5 years is a long time to reinvent yourself. And I spent every single day of those 5 years proving to myself that I was worth more than what my family believed. Ethan let me stay on his couch for 3 months. During that time, I worked 2 jobs while teaching myself advanced coding at night, surviving on coffee and maybe 4 hours of sleep if I was lucky. I took a position at a warehouse during the day loading trucks, and at night, I worked the front desk at a gym. Every spare moment, I had my laptop open, learning new programming languages and building my portfolio. Ethan never complained about me crashing in his living room, never made me feel like a burden. And when I finally landed my first freelance client 6 months later, he took me out for drinks to celebrate. That first client turned into 2 clients, then 5. Then I was building websites and custom software for small businesses all over the region. By year 2, I had enough saved up to rent a tiny apartment and officially start my consulting business. The business grew faster than I expected because I was hungry in a way that people who've never lost everything can truly understand. I underbid competitors. I worked weekends. I answered emails at 2 a.m. And I delivered results that made clients want to refer me to everyone they knew. By year 3, I had hired 2 junior developers to help with the workload. And that's when everything almost fell apart. My biggest client at the time threatened to sue me over a missed deadline that wasn't even my fault. I spent 6 months in legal battles that ate through most of my savings. Ethan represented me pro bono because he knew I couldn't afford his usual rates. There were nights when I seriously considered just giving up and getting a regular job. Ethan talked me off the ledge more than once, and we eventually won the lawsuit. But those 6 months taught me more about business than any course could have. I put new contracts in place, started requiring bigger deposits, and learned to recognize red flags in potential clients. By year 4, I was turning down projects because we were booked solid for months in advance. Ethan helped me set up the business properly, made sure all my contracts were airtight, and became not just my attorney, but my best friend and the only family that mattered. I never contacted Eleanor, Logan, or Chloe during those 5 years. And none of them ever reached out to me either, which told me everything I needed to know. 4.5 years after that rainy night, I bought a house in a neighborhood that Eleanor used to drive through when I was a kid, saying, "This is where successful people live." It was a 3-bedroom house with a big backyard, hardwood floors, and a 2-car garage. When I signed those closing papers, I felt something shift inside me. I furnished it slowly over the next 6 months, and I set up a home office with 3 monitors where I could work on my most complex projects. Ethan lived about 15 minutes away by then, and we'd have dinner at my place every couple of weeks where he'd update me on his cases, and I'd tell him about my latest difficult client. The business kept growing, and I started getting contracts with bigger companies. I realized I'd built something real. My 2 junior developers became senior developers. I hired a project manager, and we moved into an actual office space. I still lived modestly despite the money coming in, because I remembered too well what it felt like to have $200 and nowhere to sleep. Then, one Tuesday afternoon in October, I came home from a meeting with a potential client and saw 3 people standing on my front porch. I didn't recognize them at first, because 5 years changes people. But as I got closer, I realized it was Eleanor, Logan, and Chloe. They had suitcases with them, actual luggage, like they were planning to move in. Eleanor was peering through my front window. I parked in the driveway and just sat there, trying to figure out what was happening. Logan spotted me and started waving like this was some kind of happy reunion. I got out slowly, and Chloe came down the porch steps with that fake smile I recognized from every holiday gathering. "Caleb!" Eleanor called out. "We've been waiting for over an hour." I walked up without saying anything, and I could see they were looking at my house, at my car, at everything, with these expressions that were a mix of surprise and calculation. Logan spoke next, and his voice had an edge to it. "Nice place you got here, little brother," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like an accusation. I still hadn't said a word because I was trying to process why they were here after 5 years of complete silence. And then Eleanor said something that made my blood run cold. "You're alone, no wife, no kids. We're taking this house," she announced. Chloe nodded like this was already decided. They stood there on my porch like they had every right to be there, like the last 5 years hadn't happened, like they hadn't thrown me out in a storm with nothing. And I realized they thought I was still that same lost kid they could push around. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and made one call while they all watched me, confusion turning into concern. Ethan answered on the first ring, like he always did. I just said 4 words that made my family's faces change completely. "I need you here," I told him, and he didn't ask questions. He just said he'd be there in 20 minutes and hung up. Eleanor started laughing this nervous laugh and asked who I was calling. Logan made some comment about how calling a friend wasn't going to change anything. But I just leaned against my car and waited, without saying a single word. Chloe kept trying to make small talk, asking about the neighborhood and complimenting my lawn, like we were old friends catching up. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. She mentioned something about how nice the houses were around here and how she'd always wanted to live in a neighborhood like this. I realized she was already planning out which bedroom she'd take. The 20 minutes felt like an hour with them standing there on my porch, and I could see them getting more uncomfortable as the silence stretched out. Eleanor tried a different approach and started asking me direct questions about my job, about how I could afford a place like this, and whether I'd gotten married without telling them. I gave her nothing, just stood there checking my phone. Logan eventually asked if we could at least go inside to talk about this like adults. Chloe pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my house. I heard her whisper to Eleanor something about the property value in this area, which told me they'd actually researched where I lived before showing up. A silver sedan pulled up exactly 19 minutes after I'd called. Ethan got out wearing his work suit with a briefcase in his hand. The look on his face was pure professional attorney mode. My family didn't recognize him at first, because the last time they'd seen Ethan was at my college graduation almost 8 years ago. But when he walked up and shook my hand, then turned to face them with that lawyer stare he perfected, I saw Eleanor's face go pale. Ethan introduced himself as my attorney and asked them very politely what they were doing on my client's private property. The way he said private property made it sound like a threat wrapped in courtesy. Logan tried to take control by explaining that they were family and this was just a family matter that didn't concern lawyers. But Ethan opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder that contained all the documentation for my house purchase. He explained in this calm, measured voice that I had purchased this property 3 years ago, that all the paperwork was filed correctly with the county, that my name was the only name on the deed, and that they were currently trespassing. He pulled out the actual deed and held it up so they could see my name printed clearly as the sole owner. I watched Logan's confident expression crack just a little. Chloe actually laughed and said that was ridiculous, that family doesn't trespass on family. She looked at me like I was supposed to back her up. She started going on about how blood is thicker than water and how family always helps family in tough times. Eleanor nodded along like Chloe was making perfect sense. Ethan asked them if they had my permission to be there. When none of them answered, he explained that without permission, they needed to leave the property immediately or he'd be forced to contact the police. Eleanor's face went red, and she raised her voice for the first time, saying that I wouldn't dare call the cops on my own mother. Logan stepped forward like he was going to physically intimidate Ethan, which was a huge mistake, because Ethan didn't even flinch. Eleanor finally went into full manipulation mode and started in on this whole speech about how I owed them, how they raised me and fed me and put a roof over my head for 18 years, how family takes care of family in hard times. She was getting worked up now, and her voice had that edge that used to make me feel guilty when I was younger, but now it just sounded desperate. That's when I finally spoke, and my words came out quieter than I expected, but every word hit exactly how I wanted it to. "Like you took care of me 5 years ago?" I asked. The silence that followed was deafening. The look on her face told me she knew exactly what I was talking about. Logan had the decency to look down at his shoes for a second before trying to explain that they'd been under a lot of stress back then, that the family business was struggling even then, that they didn't really mean for me to actually leave. I cut him off and told them I didn't want to hear excuses, that I'd spent 5 years building a life without them, and that showing up now with suitcases demanding my house was absolutely insane. Chloe tried to downplay the suitcases and claimed they were just visiting, that they wanted to reconnect. But I pointed out that you don't bring luggage to reconnect, and you definitely don't announce you're taking someone's house. That's when the real story started coming out, and Chloe was the one who cracked first, because she'd never been good at keeping secrets. She opened her mouth to say something, but Logan shot her a look that clearly meant shut up. And that's when I knew there was more to this story. Ethan noticed it too, and pressed them, asking directly if they were in some kind of financial trouble. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively, saying they were fine, just going through a transition period. Logan kept his jaw clenched tight, but Chloe was fidgeting with her phone, and I could see the stress all over her face. "Just tell him." She finally snapped at Logan, and he told her to stay quiet, but it was too late, because once Chloe starts talking under pressure, she can't stop. That's when the whole story came tumbling out, how Logan had run the family construction business into the ground over the past 3 years, how they'd taken out loans using my parents' house as collateral, and how the bank was going to foreclose in 2 months. Eleanor jumped in trying to make it sound less bad, explaining that they'd had some setbacks and made some poor investments. But the bottom line was they were about to lose everything, and they'd somehow decided that I was their solution. Logan actually had the nerve to say that since I was alone with no wife or kids, I didn't really need a whole house to myself, and they figured I'd understand family responsibility. He explained that they'd been watching my house for a week, that they'd seen me come and go alone every day, and they concluded that I had more space than I needed. I just stared at him, trying to comprehend the logic that made them think throwing me out 5 years ago and then demanding my house now made any kind of sense. Ethan actually let out this short laugh of disbelief. Ethan stepped in before I could say something I'd regret and explained very clearly that they had no legal claim to my property, that their financial problems were not my responsibility, and that they needed to leave within the next 5 minutes or he would call the police. Eleanor tried one more approach, and this one was the emotional manipulation card she'd always played so well. "We're family, Caleb," she said with tears in her eyes that might have been real. "You can't just abandon us when we need you." The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. I looked at her and said the truest thing I'd said in 5 years. "Family doesn't throw each other out in the rain," I told her, and I watched those words land exactly where I meant them to. She tried to argue that it was different, that they were desperate now, but I reminded her that I was desperate then, and it didn't matter to any of them. Ethan escorted them off my property while they gathered their suitcases. Logan muttered something about me being selfish and how I'd regret this. Chloe tried one last time to appeal to me by saying they had nowhere else to go. I told them they should try calling some friends. Chloe actually said they'd already asked everyone they knew, and nobody would help them, which told me everything about how they burned bridges with other people, too. They drove away in what I later learned was a rental car, because they'd already sold both their vehicles to pay off some of the debt. I stood on my porch, watching their taillights disappear down my street. Ethan stayed for a couple of hours. We ordered pizza, and he told me I'd handled it better than he would have, which meant a lot coming from him. Over the next 3 months, Chloe sent me text messages almost every week. First trying to apologize, then trying to explain their situation in more detail, then eventually just begging for some kind of financial help. She told me they'd moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, that Logan was working at a hardware store, that Eleanor was devastated and barely speaking to anyone. I didn't respond to any of the messages, because I knew that any response would open a door I wanted to keep closed. Logan sent me one email about 6 months later that was mostly angry and accusatory, saying I'd abandoned the family legacy and that our dad would be ashamed of me, which was rich coming from the guy who destroyed the business our dad built. A year after that confrontation on my porch, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that they'd declared bankruptcy and lost my parents' house anyway, and that they were all living together in that same small apartment, barely making ends meet. Part of me felt something that might have been sympathy, but mostly I felt relief that I protected what I'd built and that I hadn't let them drag me down with them. Chloe sent me one final message on my birthday 2 years after the porch incident, and this one actually sounded genuine. She apologized for everything, said she understood why I wanted nothing to do with them, and that she hoped I was doing well. I read it 3 times and then left it on read, because some bridges burn for a reason, and sometimes the family you choose matters more than the family you're born into. I was completely fine with that. What do you think about a situation like that?